Hi, and welcome to episode 98 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and it's just me this week. I'm the only host. Tom and Heidi are off doing other things and being scientific. But luckily, I'm not by myself. This week, we're going to be talking with Jean Polfus, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba and who is also a Wilberforce Fellow and is also a new Liber Eero Fellow. So there are lots of titles for this very successful student. So thank you so much for joining us this week, Jean. Can you share what it is that you do?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. I am a PhD student at University of Manitoba, and I'm currently living in the Northwest Territories in a small community called Toledo, which is basically in the center of the Northwest Territories. So it's a fly-in community of about 500 people. And so we only are connected to the south on roads in the winter when there's winter roads. So just to give you a bit of context for where I'm calling in from. And I study caribou. So I have my poster behind me. And what I'm looking at is the genetic structure of the caribou herds in the Northwest Territories, as well as working with local communities to understand how Dene people and Métis people understand caribou and the relationships between the different groups, including how their language is used to describe the differences, and then comparing that and using it to help us better interpret our genetic results.
That's awesome. So I think you set the record for the most northerly person we've ever had on the show. I think we were talking before the show, and you said that you're about 1 degree south of the Arctic Circle, which that's pretty awesome. So good job, Internet, for allowing this sort of thing to happen. I'm excited about this because having looked at your stuff, I have lots of questions and lots of cool things that you're to talk about with what you're doing. And you touched on a lot of those things in your intro, so thanks. So let's talk about with some of your new work that you're doing, which is, I assume, part of your PhD. And this is talking more about the genetics of caribou and how different caribou herds and populations are related to one another. Can you tell everybody at home who's not Canadian and who hasn't seen a caribou on their quarter every day of their life a little bit about caribou and then what it is that you are specifically looking at?
Sure. So caribou are the same species as reindeer. And I have a poster that I illustrated and worked on with community members behind me of a barren ground caribou. And caribou are really especially interesting genetically for our research because there's so much interspecific variation. So much variation within the species. So if you look at a caribou from Newfoundland, it looks very different than a caribou in Alaska, which also would look different than a Siberian reindeer or a reindeer in Scandinavia. And there's also reindeer in Iceland and caribou in Greenland. So they're a circumpolar species, and they've had a really unique evolutionary history of surviving the Pleistocene glaciations, moving, retracting during warm periods, and spreading out over the world during the cold periods when there was more tundra and more boreal forest. And so all of that evolutionary history led to them having this range of adaptations to different environments. And they have different morphology, so how they look. Some have more white, some have more dark colors, some have white around their eyes, some have different kinds of antlers. And they also have different adaptations to different kinds of habitat. And where I work in the Northwest Territories, there's 3 main types of caribou. In the north, you have barren ground caribou that are the kind that you would see on a National Geographic documentary. So they have the huge migrations of thousands of kilometers a year. So they move up into the tundra to give birth in the spring to avoid predators and insects. And then in the winter, they move down into the forest, past tree line, and kind of hang out in the forest. And they're in huge aggregations. Thousands of animals can be together. And then in the boreal forest, you also have these more sedentary boreal woodland caribou, and they're adapted to more be dispersed across the landscape in small groups of maybe 5 to 15 animals, and they spread out to calve, so they're avoiding predators that way, and they don't migrate, so they stay within a home range that can vary in size but isn't nearly as gigantic as the barren ground. And then in the mountains, so right across the river from me now is the Mackenzie Mountains, which is the northern extent of the Rocky Mountain chain. And in the mountains, caribou are adapted to elevationally moving during the seasons. So they go up into the mountains and to high alpine plateaus in the summer, down into the valley bottoms in the winter. And they do have like a bit of a migration pattern that way and can move some pretty big distances as well. So when you have all that mixing, it really makes a difference in policy related to caribou, like endangered species policy, where you might draw these lines. And for example, right now, federally under the Canadian Species at Risk Act, which is similar to the US Endangered Species Act, the boreal woodland caribou, the ones that are spread out and in small groups, are currently listed as endangered. So there's certain strategies and policies related to their recovery and recovery planning that are really important, but little is still known about how much mixing occurs between the different types. So they're sometimes called ecotypes, and there's some levels of subspecies in there too. And it's still hard to sometimes discriminate because they're all still caribou. They can all still interbreed. They can still interbreed with reindeer. So it makes it challenging for management if you don't know where those boundaries are. So our research has been working with people who have a long history of living in this region. I mean, back through the last glacial cycles as well, and long dependence on caribou as a main source of food. And thus their language is so rich in words about caribou. And because each type has these different behaviors, you have to hunt them differently. So people have words to describe hunting of the boreal woodland caribou. Tonzi is the Dene word. That's different than Ekwa, which is the barren ground caribou, and which is different than Shuta-Epe, which is mountain caribou. So we really worked with people to help us understand this. And then to understand the genetics, we asked people to help us collect caribou scat. So, and we actually paid people for every pile of scat they brought back, which went over really well. And people were super engaged, and we had over 1,000 samples brought in over the course of my fieldwork, 2 years. And we used that non-invasive data to then look at their genetic markers and understand some of the genetic structure. So if the groups are able to be differentiated and how that relates to where people say they are.
That's awesome. There is so much wrapped up in there, so much stuff to do. And it always comes back to poop.
Yes.
Everything. Everything that we do on this podcast, we always come back to poop, and it's awesome, and it's great. I love that you guys were paying for pooper scoopers, essentially. That's amazing.
In the communities, I'm often known as the poop lady. These small communities that I work in, although it's nicer when they say the caribou poop lady, because I think that's, and some people will even put it in Dene language, so that's always, it's good to be known for something, I guess.
So I gotta ask, what's the Dene word for poop lady at this point?
I forget. Well, it's sone is poop. So tunze sone would be boreal woodland caribou poop, and I forgot lady now, but yeah.
That's amazing. That should be on your business card when it goes to it.
Yeah.
That's the best title. That's what I should have introduced you as for this podcast, if I could pronounce it. That's awesome. And so you guys just had a paper out this week that kind of looked into a lot of this stuff, looking at gene flow and introgression between all these different subpopulations and ecotypes of caribou, and how genes are flowing between all these things. Was this based on the scat that you had everybody collecting?
So this is actually that paper that just came out. It was as part of a larger collaboration and the work we do between my advisor, Micheline Manceau, and Paul Wilson at Trent University. And that paper was looking at the complicated history of caribou in central Canada, so in Ontario and Manitoba, where again you have mixing between different types, and it's important again to understand boundaries and the genetic relationships. And we used approximate Bayesian statistics to look back in time and kind of find different models, test thousands of models for what evolutionary history was most reasonable to have happened in that case. And the great part about that paper was that is sort of the central Canada story right now. And right at this moment, I'm working on the paper for the Northwest Territories that we're using the similar techniques. And we're looking at finding out, so these boreal woodland caribou, where their evolutionary history fits into the mix of caribou. And we're finding some really interesting things there as well. So.
That's really cool. And it's really interesting as somebody who works personally on insects. And so when we talk about glaciation, we're talking about how it's, pretty much restricted everything and is not allowed as much, individual evolution as perhaps maybe we would like, and thus we get jealous of our neighbors to the south even more because glaciers screwed with our speciation processes. But what you guys are finding, especially with the caribou, is that glaciation seems to be playing a big role in helping the diversification of these populations, correct?
Yeah, so actually the pattern that the Pleistocene glaciations produced is very different from cold adapted species than it is for the temperate species. Because during these interglacials, so right now we're in an interglacial, we're in maybe one of the super interglacial, so it might continue because of climate change, that caribou populations are actually being restricted. So they're right now being restricted from the south due to logging, oil and gas development, human developments, roads, and they're ranged in the south. So they used to be all in the northern United States, and now they're being pushed up into Canada even further. Every year there's probably more of a range restriction. But some of that is also part of the last glacial history where caribou were at one time all through the US, south of the big Laurentide ice sheet. And those caribou populations have been slowly moving north. But on the other hand, there was also an ice-free region called Beringia. That's where Alaska and the connection to Siberia was. And this area also held caribou. So during the last glacial maximum, there were caribou north of the ice sheet and there were caribou south. And so that actually happened multiple times because there was a series of glacial fluctuations. So caribou were split, they came back together, they might have had replacement or loss of gene flow, but that integration may also have produced this amazing variation and genetic variation that we see in caribou. So the other thing about their morphology, so how they look different in different places, is that I think caribou are especially interesting in this way because if you look at moose, for example, another large ungulate found across the boreal forest, they basically look like moose from Maine to Alaska. There might be size differences, they might have some behavioral differences in the mountains versus the flats, but they look like dark colored. Whereas caribou really, we had a project where we asked people to send us in caribou photos from all over the country, and I show those sometimes to classrooms, to kids, even to adults, and everyone's like, that's a caribou? That doesn't look like a caribou. Because people are so, I think, such good visual learners that when they really learn to tell the differences between the kinds they know, and then they see these other caribou, like there's these really small ones that are some of the most southern caribou that exist in North America on the Slate Islands in northern Lake Superior, and they're really small. They're really dark colored, and I showed them to some students here in the Sawtooth, and they're like, are you sure those aren't dogs? So they knew a certain dog that looked just like those caribou, and we had a good laugh about that one.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I can imagine, having the same species look that different, that some people used to theirs are making a somewhat humorous but also somewhat accurate call on it being a dog with antlers. That's amazing. So that's a good tip. So if you've seen one moose, you've basically seen them all. But caribou, you got to travel more to see more, the whole diversity of the whole thing.
Right.
That's really cool. And so this idea of having broad, diverse populations of this comes back to the conservation aspect that you were talking about earlier, and how in Canada there is a lot of discussion actually about conservation status of caribou. Even somebody like myself who doesn't talk or doesn't do a lot of research on conservation, nor pays a whole lot of attention to mammals. I obviously know that it's going on, and that there's a lot of discussion about, how do we protect caribou, especially because I guess it's the boreal ones, the ones that live in the trees, are overlapping a lot with natural resources, perhaps, that other people may value more than a species that has such a broad range, you know, in the broadest sense of the word species here. And so how does your work factor into these conservation discussions?
Yeah, so I mean, you brought up the key point there, which is that you have lots of development, lots of resources in similar habitats that caribou use. And because caribou are so move a lot and are kind of in constant motion, moving from one place to the next to find food, they need large areas, and they need large areas of intact forest. And especially the boreal caribou in the south use usually old growth forests. So you can imagine involved with this in the boreal forest was a really dynamic system that has huge fires and has, through evolutionary time, had massive burning. So a patch of forest might burn, but the caribou need to be able to move to the next area or move into a new. So over time, there was probably this continuous distribution of moving small populations as they found really good old growth forest. But as people have come in, more roads and fragmentation, it's broken up their ability to maybe react and respond to the natural changes that have always been a part of their evolution. And this is a kind of pressing issue in Canada, especially the further south you go. And what we're finding, what we want to point out genetically is that one place of research that we're really interested in is that we could look at some of these important adaptations. And when you think about it evolutionarily, these adaptations to the boreal forest might be key to the boreal forest moving north, might be key kinds of genes that need to be part of a dynamic system where caribou have always probably had some exchange between different types. So the barren ground, the boreal, the mountain, and that might be crucial to their persistence long-term as a species. So not all species survive these last glaciations. So we have muskox, which are in the farther north, but are moving south sometimes. And caribou are the two kind of Pleistocene mammals that didn't go extinct, the mammoths and the mastodons and the steep bison and the horses and all the other Pleistocene large mammals. So something allowed them to have the genetic diversity was at least part of the picture that allowed them to be able to adapt to the changing world. And that might be one of the reasons they continue to persist today. But what we don't want to do as far as conservation goes is limit their ability to move. And this is actually what Dene people and Indigenous people across Canada often say, is that we need to allow caribou to move freely across the landscape, because that's what they do. That's how they're supposed to. And I think that one of the best ways to conserve caribou in Canada is to listen to the people who have evolved through time with them and whose identities are tied to caribou, to help us understand how caribou are in the system and ecology as part of a relationship with people. And by giving people who have that kind of history with caribou, decision-making, power in charge of their management and be part of the research process, I think that that's one way to really find sustainable solutions to conservation issues.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing that you're working on, and obviously you're embedded with these native peoples and these native communities, and you're incorporating that beyond just asking for their help in collecting poop and all that, but you're incorporating their traditional knowledge of these practices, of how the herds move, how the biology of the herds, as well as talking with them about conservation matters. That seems like a really important aspect to this that perhaps doesn't get taken into account in a lot of different ways. How much of a role is that in your personal research and in the stuff that you want to do coming up?
Yeah, it's definitely the motivation for my research. So it's always a bit of a challenge to work with communities to balance the community's needs and your academic requirements. So I have to complete a series of steps to finish the PhD. But we are responding to community needs, and there was the community for caribou research that was done in a way that respects their traditional knowledge and it doesn't harm the caribou. So non-invasive research. So we came in with a proposal to collect scat and not have to touch the caribou and learn about some different parts of caribou's lives that way. And the really great thing is that we held lots of focus group meetings, and I have co-authors who are from the communities on my paper. And what we find is that genetic data is, in my opinion, there's a certain amount that's just facts, and have to at some point bring that together, look for patterns, and then interpret those patterns in context. And so the people who really understand the system and have language to describe it in unique ways that English doesn't are the Dene people who live here. And so what I have found is that I'm able to, by using their knowledge and listening to people tell their stories over and over, interpret the genetic data and see patterns that I might not have seen. So one story I tell is that an elder from Fort Good Hope talks about a herd of caribou that crossed the Mackenzie River during his lifetime, but when he was young, and went into the foothills of the mountains. So these are the barren ground caribou. And they never all came back. So they said they never saw the whole herd come back. So we did a specific trip out in the mountains there, members of the community, and we collected scat. And interestingly, that scat, that DNA from those caribou more closely assigned to the barren ground herds than it did to the mountain or to the woodland. So we probably wouldn't have known why we would have found some caribou assigned in the mountains if we didn't talk to people who have such an intimate relationship with the land and with the animals that live there. So that's wow. Just one story of ways that the two types of knowledge come together.
That's amazing. That is like such an amazing example of the benefits and the power of involving people that are intimately familiar with these taxa and these problems to do it. That's such a cool story that I'm sure will be used as a road sign for many more people who are looking forward to doing sort of this sort of thing and to incorporate these same methods in other projects.
Yeah, the cool thing about genetics is that it's all about relationships, right? And I found that Dene language and the way that people talk about things is often about relationships. So it's about people's relationships with animals, but also if you talk about caribou, you have to talk about muskox, you have to talk about wolves, you have to talk about the lichen that they eat. So people don't like to talk about just specific things in isolation, because in ecology we don't either, because we know it's related to the climate, if there was an icing, freezing rain event, or all these other things impact populations. And that's really the fun part about ecology. It's for me, it's not a science that just has a direct route to an answer. It's definitely a kind of big picture, conceptual thinking kind of research that I really enjoy. Yeah.
That's awesome. That is super exciting. As somebody who doesn't do ecology, I love seeing people passionate about it and going after their passions in that way. So that's great. I can't wait to see what you come up with in the coming years with all of your new research, because I think it's gonna be fun to follow. So another thing that you're doing, and which also is incredibly fun, I spent about 10 minutes before we went on the air and all that going over it, was the Caribou photo collection project. I'll let you explain it, but like I said, it was a lot of fun. Again, I'm used to staring at things and telling differences between insects, but getting to do it on caribou was cool. So can you explain what the photo collection project was and what the goal is, and also how people can get involved?
Yeah, so this one, so just a little caveat. I know we shouldn't always do caveats as scientists, but we were hoping this was going to be maybe part of my PhD, but we didn't have funding to do it, and it kind of is at the still something we're all very interested in. So like I said before, caribou have this variation across their range, and they look different. And so what we were wondering is, does the actual morphological differences between caribou correlate at all with the genetic samples? And as part of by my lab group, we have collected caribou samples from across the distribution of caribou in Canada, and that genetic database is always growing. I think it's fascinating and super exciting. But we don't have a database of the pictures or of how caribou look. So we a couple of years ago to send in pictures of caribou, and lots of people did. It was amazing. And what we know about like some of these citizen science research projects, like the Galaxy, I think who was it called? Zooniverse was the first one, and they asked people to look at galaxies and tell you if they were like circular or ellipse, or I'm not sure. But the thing is that the computer algorithms couldn't think that they had galaxy. And it's the same idea with the caribou. So computers probably algorithms aren't good enough yet to look at a caribou and tell you if it's similar to another one. So we were asking, so we actually have a beta website up where you can look at different pictures of caribou and then tell us if these two are similar or not. And we were going to bring all that data together and find out if it matched any of the genetic variation that we see in caribou, by using people to tell if caribou look the same or different in different places. So that might be a project that I'll get to pursue postdoc or following that at some point. I think it's science stuff is taking off always with the ease of using the internet. So I think it could be it's still a fun idea to me.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was a lot of fun, and as somebody who obviously hasn't looked at a lot of caribou other than on my money, I thought it was amazing how many differences there were. I got photos that were looking, telling how the faces were different, and there'd be eye rings, or there'd be muzzle colors and stuff like that, or patterns on the forehead, and then there was flank questions where you'd look at the sides of the animals and you'd see crazy differences, and even antlers. The shape and styles of the antlers looked like they were different. And you guys said we're asking people to do all this stuff. I thought it was a really cool thing, and I enjoyed it. I was almost late for actually our recording because I was busy clicking on the photos and doing that. So I think it's really neat. So I hope that you are able to continue doing that project in the future, because I think it's, I don't know, if nothing else, it gets people thinking and seeing caribou in a new light.
Yeah. And the other avenue that would be a way to look at that one too is if we find some interesting traits that vary a lot, that might be a place where we could start looking for functional genes. So the genes that actually are coding for behavior, or perhaps some of the behaviors are tied to some of the like antler shape, or maybe more commonly something with the face shape. And then that might be a gene that we would then target to look at to see if there's actual functional differences in the adaptations between different habitats. So that's probably coming in the next 10 or so years. So genomics work in wildlife is still at the cutting edge, but the techniques are increasingly coming down in cost with next generation sequencing. And the caribou genome is not far off, so keep your eye out for that in the next maybe 5 years, maybe less. So yeah, it'll be fun.
That's great. And I love the idea of taking, crowdsourced human eye knowledge and adding it to, the cutting edge, like you said, and marrying those two things. And then tying it all back to traditional knowledge, like you were talking about earlier, because they've got most of this stuff figured out on their own already.
Yeah, sometimes I think we should just have like Indigenous people look at these pictures, because they have even more developed eye for looking at caribou, but it's often like, oh, that's a fat one. I think that would be a good one to eat. So I've been out on the land with people who have grown up with caribou, and they can tell so many different things about caribou just by seeing a track. So when they see the actual animal, they know, they pick up on a lot of different specifics about them that we might not, since we didn't grow up. If you didn't grow up hunting caribou, you wouldn't really know. So that's always really special.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing, and it's especially incredible that that the knowledge that they've gained and have passed down is striking so similarly to the new techniques and ways that scientists are finally getting around to answering some of these questions that they've already figured out in many ways. So I think it's wonderful, and I think it's great that you guys are doing so much work on keeping that traditional knowledge a part of the conversation, and incorporating it as much as you are, and putting it through the scientific method and testing it in some ways too.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time, but one thing that I wanted to talk to you about briefly before we go is how much you like to involve art with your science. So browsing through your website, you've got all sorts of amazing illustrations and diagrams and pieces of art. And as we'll get to later when you share your social media stuff with everybody so they can follow along, your Instagram is full of amazing photos from the North. And it's a treat to watch that. So can you explain a little bit why you think scientists need to be marrying art with their work a little more than perhaps we've been doing?
Yeah, so this is something I feel really privileged to be thinking about a lot more in my PhD, and I think that's sort of part of what a PhD is. You get to kind of be a little bit more independent and kind of grow some of your own strengths. So I grew up the daughter of an artist. My mom is a potter and painter, and she taught kindergarten through 8th grade art for many, many years. So I was always taught to draw, and she used to set up still lifes for me to draw. And I did that all through university, but it wasn't until my PhD that I just realized how important that strength is. And so there's a number of key points. One is communication. So up here in the North, we often are speaking with people whose English is a second language, and some of the elders don't speak English. So we always have interpreters. And when I first, I think it would be really fun to look back at some of my first presentations trying to explain genetics. And I fumbled. I was using way too big of words and not using the right kind of analogies to help people understand. And I realized that, drawings of relationships between animals and explaining it in the context of humans and how people are related between communities is a much better way. And so we worked with interpreters to find better analogies to use that resonated with people. And then I also have just really, really stepped up my game as far as trying to depict this visually. And another strength of using something like this is an illustration I did of a barren ground caribou, is that when you're drawing, you get to choose which visual components to include. And photos are beautiful. I've gotten really into photography since my time in the North because I'm surrounded in a landscape that I find breathtaking and I want to share with people. But photos can be distracting. So a picture of a caribou in the environment, you might be looking more at the environment or the tracks or what the snow is like, or the light might be different in certain contexts. But when you do an illustration of a caribou, you can pinpoint the specific things that people have been telling me make barren ground caribou ekwe different than tonzi, different than shuta epe. So I tried to use some of those points, and that's what natural history illustrators have been doing for hundreds of years, is using their illustration to show people the distinct traits of a species that then can help you identify it. So that's another key point. Another is that people like to see art, and it gets people involved right away. And I think you've had other guests who have talked about this too, right? Like, people are interested in science, but sometimes it can seem sort of distant, and you see these incredibly complex charts, or even some of the genetic output we get is visually distracting. And so if you can draw people into what the kind of work you're doing with art, then I think you can start some more diverse conversations. And finally, I think what I really want to keep working on is trying to have other people depict their understanding of the world through art, whatever form that they see is most appropriate. And not just me doing the job, working with other people who are amazing artists in their own right, and who might be able to teach scientists something about the way that they perceive the world through depicting it through art. So that's what I'm also really excited for. And that's part of what I'm going to be looking at in my postdoc coming up, the Library Euro.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And like I said, everybody who's listening, you really need to go and check out Jean's website and scroll through some of her portfolios, because they're stunning line drawings. The single line drawings with the caribou on the ice with the salmon underneath it. Amazing stuff. And I like that you've got all of your diagrams and stuff like that incorporated throughout your degree and as well as your outreach things. And I really like your point about, you know, how it serves as a bridge essentially to help people get across what they're from one point to another. And I think that's something that we as scientists should be doing a lot better at. Yeah. So I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell everybody at home where they can find you online, how they can follow along with your exploration of the Arctic, as well as exploration of caribou biology and the intersections of art and science?
Yeah, so I have a number of sites. Most are just my name, Jean Polfus, so JeanPolfus. So that's Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram are just my name. And you can also find me on the other science social media, LinkedIn and ResearchGate. But I also have an Etsy shop where I sell prints of my photography and drawings. So that's Wildline Studio, or you can search my name on Etsy. And yeah, I thank you. I'm enjoying learning more about social media every year, and I've been fortunate to have some trainings in sort of how scientists can use social media through Wilberforce workshop. And so I think it's like you guys do a great job, and I've been following all of your past guests, and there's so much neat stuff to learn about the world, so it's really fun.
Yeah, it's great how social media is allowing us to meet all these new cool people that are out of our disciplines and just, like you said, get to know the world in a better way from the sources that are doing the discovering themselves. So everybody at home, we'll be sure to have links to all of Jean's various websites and social media accounts so that you can find those and follow along with her career, as well as links to some of the other things that we talked about today, including her open access paper on caribou hybridization and the caribou photo collection, which I encourage you all to go and talk about so that Jean has plenty of people interested in it that she can take to funders and say, look at this great thing. Help me get some money to do this properly. So we'll have those all at our website, which is, of course, at breakingbio.com. And you can follow us online as well by finding the Breaking Bio podcast on Facebook, searching for that. You can find us on Twitter at Breaking Bio. And, of course, you can find us on iTunes and Stitcher to take us with you and listen to all of the past episodes. We're coming up on number 100, and we have a special guest lined up for 100. We already know who it is. We're super prepared this time. And that'll be coming out really soon, so I hope you guys will look forward to it. We need to thank the European Society for Evolutionary Biology for providing funding that allows us to host and keep this show on the internet and delivered to you. And of course, we need to thank Jean, as always, for coming and talking to us this week and sharing all of her passion about science, art, and of course, caribou. So thanks so much, Jean, and thank you everybody at home for listening as always. And I hope you'll join us next week when we have a new guest.